Another NFL season is in the books. In time, we will turn our sights onto 2025, but before we head off into that deep unknown, we have the 2024 season to look back upon. We put the final bow on this season by ranking every team in the league from number 32 all the way to number 1, with a few other tidbits as well. We will be ranking these teams by using C-Score, this channel's metric for evaluating every single team during the Super Bowl era. For a deeper explanation of C-Score, be sure to check out the description of this video. What we will not be doing is using this, the NFL standings. Anybody with even a passing understanding of the spoken word can read off these records from worst to best. That's not our game. This audience is more advanced than that, and quite frankly, so is this channel. A team's record matters, but not all records are created equally. When determining overall quality from start to finish, there is so much more to look at, and that's what we do. So some of these ratings may seem controversial on the face of it, but they are rooted in a team's total season performance. Thank you for joining us today. Without further ado, let's get this thing started. Rooted at the bottom of the pile are the Carolina Panthers. They did go 5-12 this season, but that point differential of negative 193 really brought them down. That was led by their worst in the league 32nd ranking in points allowed. In points scored, they were 23rd. They played a middle-of-the-road schedule tied for 13th hardest in the league. All that adds up to a C-score of negative 25.678. It's true that the Panthers were one of the most improved teams over the second half of the season, especially offensively, where they did climb to the edge of the bottom 10 in points scored. But they were teetering on all-time worst status in the first half of the season, so their improvement wasn't enough to pull them out of the abyss. In 31st place are the Cleveland Browns. That record sure doesn't look great, 3-14, along with being outscored by 177 points. Whereas the Panthers were last in the league in points allowed, the Browns were last in the league in points scored. They were still bottom 10 in allowing points. They did play a difficult schedule that was tied for second hardest in the league. Their C-score this season is negative 23.782. A playoff team last season, Cleveland hit the skids in a hard way this season. They joined the Panthers as the only team in the league to be outscored by more than 10 points per game. It won't be too hard for anyone to understand why Myles Garrett, a future Hall of Famer still in his prime, is asking for a trade from this moribund franchise. Kicking off the top 30 are the Tennessee Titans. They too finished 3-14, a better point differential but still bad at negative 149. 27th in points scored, 30th in points allowed. They tied the Panthers for the 13th hardest schedule in the league. That C-score will sit at negative 21.726. The Titans are third worst here, so in a sense, they did well to land the number 1 overall pick in next season's draft. 2 of their wins were actually impressive, a 19-point win over the Dolphins in Miami, and going to Houston and beating a team that made it to the Final 8. They also didn't end a single home game this season with the lead at the end of regulation. We've still got a lot of muck to go through here. At number 29 are the New York Giants. They also finished 3-14, their point differential was negative 142. They were the second worst scoring team in the league, but as far as points allowed go, they were relatively okay at 21st. They tied for the 15th hardest schedule in the league, right around average, but that C-score, not so average, negative 21.188. This franchise gave Daniel Jones a $40 million per year contract, and in the process said goodbye to Xavier McKinney, Leonard Williams, and Saquon Barkley, among others. That's it. That's our coverage of the 2024 New York Giants. See you at around this spot in the countdown next season. Times remain tough for the New England Patriots, who are here at number 28. They put up a 4-13 record while getting outscored by 128 points. They were third worst in the league in scoring points, 22nd in points allowed for what basically amounts to the worst Patriots defense this century. Their schedule also wasn't very difficult, only tied for 22nd. That gives them a C-score of negative 20.596. While it became pretty clear this season that the Patriots' downfall last season wasn't Bill Belichick's fault, it was presumptuous to fire Gerard Mayo after only one season. You never want to be the guy who follows the legend. You want to be the guy who follows the guy. Interesting note here though, the two quarterbacks the Patriots have drafted in the past 4 seasons have both made it to the Pro Bowl. Take whatever meaning you want to out of that. Here's a team that may have looked like it was on the upswing, but they finished 27th this season. This is the Jacksonville Jaguars with their 4-13 record. Outscored by 115 points, they don't look too good on any of these numbers here. 26th in points scored, tied for 27th in points allowed, tied for 27th in strength of schedule. That all adds up to a C-score of negative 19.211. Plenty of teams finished in the bottom 10 in both points scored and points allowed, but the Jaguars were the only team this season that did that while also playing a bottom 10 schedule. Silver linings are tough to find in the Jaguar season, but there is a talent base that could suggest a turnaround may come sooner rather than later. These C-scores are creeping up, but they remained in the double-digit negatives. At 26 are the Las Vegas Raiders. They put up a 4-13 season. They were outscored by 125 points. They were near the bottom in both points scored and points allowed, but their saving grace is that strength of schedule, which ranked out as the 5th hardest in the league. That C-score, though, still stays pretty low, negative 16.987. A lot of people had the Raiders as a dark horse playoff contender before the season. Hand in the air, I know I did. An early season win at Baltimore heightened those thoughts. A home loss the next week to the Panthers, though, was the beginning of the end for those thoughts. They only scored more than 20 points in a game 4 times all season, topping out at 26 in that same Ravens game. Moving along to the top end of the bottom quarter of the league are the Dallas Cowboys at number 25. That record doesn't on the face of it look too bad. They were 7-10, but they were still outscored by 118 points. They were 21st in points scored, but they were 2nd from the bottom in points allowed. Their strength of schedule edges onto the top 10. Their C-score comes in at negative 14.837. Quite the fall from grace for Dallas, who had 3 excellent regular seasons prior to this one. There were injuries, sure, but their fall to the worst scoring defense in the entire league, not named the Panthers, was a bit shocking. Their worst such showing since the 2010 season. At least they can say they're the best team that says they're from New York but really isn't. At number 24 are the New York Jets. They went 5-12, but that point differential for a 5-12 record isn't too bad at negative 66. However, they weren't very adept at scoring or stopping others from scoring, and their strength of schedule was only the 21st hardest in the league. That leaves them with a C-score of negative 11.82. Oh, the Jets, always with the hype, always under the belief that one player can turn their team around when their franchise is, what's the best word here? I guess fractured. I can go with that. Anyway, the last time the Jets made the playoffs, Toy Story 3 was the year's highest grossing movie. They are well on their way to claiming the title of Worst Team of the Decade. This is the 10th worst team of the 2024 NFL season. At number 23 are the New Orleans Saints. Their 5-12 record is somewhat offset by a negative 60 point differential, but they couldn't break through into the top half of the league of any of the 3 categories we have listed here: points scored, points allowed, and strength of schedule. The points allowed was best at only 19th. That will give them a C-score of negative 11.321. The Saints got off to quite the start this season, hammering the Panthers and the Cowboys. That win against Dallas, though, lost a lot of luster. Then the Saints proceeded to go 3-12 the rest of the way. The vapor trail from that early start helps, but it wasn't enough to keep the Saints out of the league's bottom 10. We've finally made our way to the single-digit negative C-scores. Coming in at number 22 are the Indianapolis Colts. They were 8-9 with a negative 50-point differential. They just missed making the top half of the league in points scored, finishing at number 17. But they were 24th in points allowed and only had the 25th hardest schedule in the league. That will give them a C-score of negative 8.461. What is it with the Colts, man? They always seem to put out a record that exceeds their actual play on the field. This wasn't as egregious as some of their past performances, but it seems to be part of the franchise DNA. Anyway, despite playing in a weak division, Indy continues to look for their breakthrough. At number 21, we have the highest ranked team that fired their head coach. This is the Chicago Bears. They finished 5-12, only getting outscored by 60 points, not terrible for a 5-12 record. Scoring points was hard to come by, they were the 5th worst in the league, but they weren't too bad defensively, finishing 13th in points allowed in the top half of the league. Also, that strength of schedule, playing in the NFC North, was tied for second hardest. That gives them a reasonably okay C-score of negative 7.78. The Bears were able to beat up on a much easier schedule early in the season on the way to a 4-2 start. They then looked primed for a big win in Washington before that Hail Mary happened. 9 more consecutive losses followed that one, including a hilarious meltdown on national television on Thanksgiving Day. They do have some pieces though. Keep an eye on them next season. We've entered the top 20, and at number 20 are the Miami Dolphins. On paper, they look pretty average, going 8-9, only getting outscored by 19 points. Their 22nd ranking in points scored somewhat balances with their 10th ranking in points allowed. What drilled the Dolphins, though, was that strength of schedule, which was the easiest in the league. That lowered their C-score to negative 6.938. To the extent that a team this mediocre could be carried, it was the defense that pulled the weight in Miami this season. They allowed 20 points or fewer 9 times, while the offense, usually the calling card under head coach Mike McDaniel, failed to clear 20 points in each of its first 6 games, with 10 such games overall. Injuries were certainly a factor, but it's not a stretch to have expected just a little better. We head on over to 19th place, where we find the Atlanta Falcons. They too carried an 8-9 record with a point differential of negative 34. They didn't do too badly scoring the ball, finishing tied for 13th in the league, but that points allowed was 10th worst. Their strength of schedule was slightly below league average at 18th hardest. This gave them a C-score of negative 5.382. The Falcons did start the season at 6-3, including a sweep of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, their primary division rival. That did turn out to be their peak, and with a chance to still make the playoffs, they lost their last 2 games of the season, both in overtime. Falcons gonna Falcon. We have quite the disappointment sitting here in 18th place, the San Francisco 49ers. Their record is worse than some of the teams you've already seen at 6-11, and their point differential is somewhat comparable at negative 47. Tied for 13th in points scored, dropping all the way down to 29th in points allowed. But what sets them apart from the teams immediately behind them is that strength of schedule, which was the hardest in the league. They're still in a negative C-score range though, at minus 4.627. The Niners had some injuries this season, there's no question about it, but they also got their tail kicked several times and blew some winnable games. And now, they're going to make a Daniel Jones level mistake. No, Brock Purdy isn't as bad as Jones, but he's going to clear his pay by more than 50%. At least the prospect of blowing yet another double-digit lead in the Super Bowl isn't on the immediate horizon. At number 17, we have finally entered the realm of positive C-scores, giving us more teams with a positive score than negative. This is the Houston Texans. They finished 10-7, and that 0 next to that record means they scored just as many points this season as they allowed. That lands them 19th in points scored and 14th in points allowed. But playing in a weak division, the AFC South, hurts their strength of schedule, which was tied for 25th hardest. but winning a game in the first round of the playoffs before putting up a fight in the divisional round was enough to pull that C-score up to 0.821. Houston is not only the first playoff team to show up on this countdown, they're also the first team with a winning record. They're not anybody's first choice of teams to play against, but their pedestrian performance in that weak division leaves them starving for something that can finally push them past the divisional round. We go back to a non-playoff team to kick off the second half of the countdown. At number 16 are the Cincinnati Bengals. They pulled their way up to a 9-8 record and were able to outscore their opponents by 38. The offense is what did the trick here. They finished 6th in scoring this season, but they hemorrhaged points as well, finishing tied for 25th in that category. Their strength of schedule also does them no favors, only tied for 27th in the league, but there was enough quality here to get them into positive range with a C-score of 2.96. Every team that doesn't win the Super Bowl has a few what-ifs that hang over the season, but the Bengals may have more than anyone else. What if they weren't 1-4 and 4-8 at various points in the season? What if they didn't hemorrhage all those points so many times? What if they could have rode their 5-game winning streak to end the season into the playoffs, among many others? The Seattle Seahawks land in the number 15 spot. Their 10-7 record somewhat begs for a better point differential than just +7. They were 18th in the league in scoring, tied for 11th in points allowed. They did it against the top 10 schedule, 8th hardest in the league. That's enough to keep them in the positive here. 3.073 is their C-score. Seattle wasn't the only team with a winning record to miss the playoffs this season, but they were the only 10-win team. The crazy thing is that they went 7-1 on the road, but only went 3-6 at home, where their stadium has often been a fortress in the past. Had they made the playoffs, they would have probably preferred to be the 7th seed. Coming in at 14th place are the Seahawks division rival, the Los Angeles Rams. They finished 10-7, and their point differential was actually worse than Seattle's, getting outscored by 19 points. They were in the bottom half of the league in both points scored and in points allowed, but their strength of schedule was right there where they needed to be at 4th hardest. They did win a playoff game against the Vikings before falling to the eventual Super Bowl champion Eagles. That gives them a C-score of 3.402. Now that the Rams have actually held on to and used their draft picks, they are starting to build a foundation for the future. A division title and a playoff win isn't a bad season by any means, but the feeling that there can be more will persist. Avoiding those bottom half finishes in both scoring and points allowed makes for a strong first step. We get all 4 teams from the NFC West grouped up in a bunch of 6. These are the Arizona Cardinals at number 13. Their record was only 8-9, but they showed the potential for more by outscoring their opponents by 21 points. Also, unlike the Rams, they finished in the top half of the league in both points scored and points allowed. They also had a difficult schedule that was tied for 6th hardest. Their C-score is 3.717. The Cardinals, despite that 8-9 finish, rank out as the season's best sub-500 team and its highest ranked non-playoff team. Their 3-5 record in one-score games against the Rams' 8-4 record in that same space was what ultimately cost them. Outside of a 4-game winning streak, they never did win back-to-back games. It's only playoff teams from here on out. At number 12 are the Pittsburgh Steelers. They went 10-7, outscoring their opponents by 33 points. They were right in the middle of the league in points scored at 16th and strength of schedule at 17th, but they were in the top quarter of the league at 8th in points allowed. They did have to go to Baltimore in the playoffs where they met their ultimate undoing. All that gave them a C-score of 4.944. We may as well start the Steelers off at 9 wins every season, or at least 8 wins and a tie, because they still haven't suffered a losing season since Mike Tomlin took over as head coach, all the way back in the 2007 season. It's actually been since 2003 since they've suffered that fate. Children born on the last day of that season can now legally drink and gamble. That said, except for their scoring defense, Pittsburgh was painfully average at everything else this season. Just missing the top 10 in 11th place are the Washington Commanders. They had a great record at 12-5 and were very close to outscoring their opponents by 100 points this season. They were 10th in points scored, a little below league average, and points allowed at 18th. They were brought down by the second easiest schedule in the league, but they made it to the playoffs and proved themselves to be road warriors, winning in Tampa and in Detroit before ultimately falling in Philadelphia. That was all good enough for a C-score of 9.819. Washington had the biggest turnaround in the league this season by a fairly significant margin. They did use quite a bit of magic to do so, going 8-2 in one-score games, but they also had a winning record in multiple-score games. It might have been expected that they would have some highlights this season, but advancing to the franchise's first NFC title game in 33 years was quite the pleasant surprise. Here they are, in 10th place, the Super Bowl runner-up Kansas City Chiefs. That record sure looks great, 15-2. The point differential for a record that good, not so much at plus 59. They were right around the middle of the pack in scoring this season, finishing 15th in the league. Their points allowed were very good at 4th. Their strength of schedule was also top 10 at tied for 9th. This is certainly not a bad team. They obviously made it to the Super Bowl, but that record is a bit too gaudy. One interesting note about the Chiefs this season, for the third consecutive Super Bowl, Patrick Mahomes threw a touchdown pass to somebody they traded for mid-season. It goes Kadarius Toney, Mecole Hardman, and DeAndre Hopkins. The C-score on its own of 12.404 is good, it is double digits, but once again, it just doesn't line up with that record. Now, it's one thing to go 10-0 in one-score games, the second most wins of that kind without a loss in the entire Super Bowl era, trailing only the 2022 Minnesota Vikings. It's the wacky and wild way they won so many of those games, including some contests against some less than stellar competition. Some would even call it devil magic. Now, one game can't necessarily prove anything, but that Super Bowl sure was telling. It seems the chickens finally came home to roost. As the C-scores remain in the double digits, our rankings are now in the single digits. At number 9 are the Los Angeles Chargers. They went 11-6 and are the first team we've seen on this countdown to outscore their opponents by triple digits. They scored the ball fairly well at 11th best in the league, but that point differential comes from their defense, number 1 in the league in points allowed. They didn't really show up for the playoffs though, maybe a factor of that strength of schedule, which was only tied for 22nd best. Their C-score is 12.68. The last time the Chargers led the league in fewest points allowed was never, at least not during the Super Bowl era. Gotta go all the way back to the 1963 AFL season, a season where they were crowned as league champions. Now this was in a pre-chargering era. This is now when they get to the playoffs and give up more points than they did in any regular season game except for one. Chargers, gonna Charger. We've now reached the top quarter of the league. In 8th place are the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They went 10-7, but they did so by outscoring their opponents by 117 points. One side of the ball looked really well, 4th in points scored. The other side, very average, 16th in points allowed. This with a bottom half of the league strength of schedule at 20th. They got to host a playoff game but couldn't pull off the victory. Their C-score is 14.098. The Buccaneers were the inverse of the Bears. The meat of their schedule was early, giving them a less than ideal record. They then faced an easier road the rest of the way, giving them a few more wins. They made it harder on themselves when they lost to the Cowboys, but they were able to win their 4th straight division title. And they did it with an actual winning record. Our 7th place team, and incidentally our highest ranked AFC West team, are the Denver Broncos. Their 10-7 record was greatly supplemented by a point differential of plus 114. They finished in the top 10 in both points scored and points allowed, exactly 10th in scoring, 3rd best in allowing points. Their strength of schedule wasn't terrible, but it was 19th best in the league. They certainly took it on the chin in the playoffs against the Bills. Their C-score is 14.291. And while the playoffs themselves didn't go exactly as planned for Denver, it was a triumphant return after a 9-year absence. They somewhat quietly had 5 AP All-Pros this season, including 3 on the first team, as well as the NFL Defensive Player of the Year in Patrick Surtain. And we'll mention this for a second time, as far as C-score goes, they were the AFC West's best team this season. We're getting close to the true big guns here. Coming in at number 6 are the Minnesota Vikings. Their record isn't quite as deceptive as the Chiefs, but at 14-3, that point differential of plus 100 leaves a little wanting. But they were solid across the board. 9th in scoring, 5th in points allowed. Their strength of schedule was tied for 15th best in the league. However, they were not able to win a playoff game this season, and their C-score, while still good, languished at 16.063. Have you ever been on a 200-mile car ride, only for your car to break down right near the end? If you have, then you understand the plight of the 2024 Minnesota Vikings. They became the first team in the Super Bowl era to lose exactly 4 games in a season, 2 each to 2 different teams who weren't in the same division. They made history as the first ever non-division champion with 14 wins, but they made that other history as well. Top 5 time, and while it may be surprising to see a team that finished 3rd place in its own division at this spot, it was truly earned. This is the Green Bay Packers, carrying an 11-6 record, but a point differential of plus 122. They were pretty consistent across the board here, 8th in scoring, 6th in points allowed, tied for 6th in strength of schedule. But for the 2nd straight season, they earned the number 7 seed, but they weren't able to win a playoff game for a 2nd straight season. They check in with a C-score of 18.185. Well, they didn't get the opportunity to play the Cowboys in the playoffs this season. Going 6-1 in multiple possession games and only 5-5 in one-score games will yield the kind of results the Packers had this season. A little more luck would have gone a long way. They are one of only 2 teams this season to be top 10 in points scored, points allowed, and strength of schedule. They began and ended their season with a loss to the eventual Super Bowl champions. We get a pretty good jump in C-score here. At number 4 are the Buffalo Bills. They went 13-4, like they tend to do. They outscored their opponents by 157 points, like they tend to do. They were 2nd best in scoring, pretty on the nose. Tied for 11th in points allowed. Strength of schedule, not so great, but they were able to overcome it with their overall performance. They looked great to start the playoffs with a big win, got a smaller win against a big opponent, and then fell where they usually do. Their C-score, though, is 23.023. Woe be on to the Buffalo Bills, who have now officially moved up from the 10th best 5-year run without a Super Bowl win to 5th. They've also taken 2nd place for the best 5-year run without even making it to the Super Bowl. They can beat the Chiefs in the regular season, like they did this season. But they can't beat them in the playoffs, like they also didn't this season. Other external factors aside, they did have their chances to win that game. Continuing their mostly overall excellent performance of the last half-decade, the Baltimore Ravens are the number 3 team this season. They went 12-5, but they put up that big point differential of plus 157. They were 3rd in points scored, 9th in points allowed, just missed the trifecta of top 10 with the 11th hardest schedule. They were able to win a playoff game, but they met their fate in Buffalo in the divisional round. That gives them a C-score of 23.945. Now, even though the Ravens did take that loss to the Bills, they had enough juice from their regular season to edge them out by fewer than a single point of C-score. Baltimore was their usual mix of excellent defense and dynamic offense, but two bad regular season losses to the Raiders and the Browns cost them a better playoff seed, which could have been their ultimate undoing. Maybe this entry requires something of a dramatic drum roll. At number 2 are the Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles. They were stellar all season long, especially after September, with a 14-3 record and a positive 160-point differential. They were 7th best in points scored, 2nd best in points allowed. The only thing that slightly hurt them was that strength of schedule, which was the 3rd easiest in the league. Once the playoffs started though, this team was on its way. They did have to play in the wild card round, but took that challenge on all the way through to a dominant Super Bowl victory. Their C-score is 28.285. Football is won in the trenches. Period. End of story. Quarterbacks get the glory, running backs get the praise. Every now and then a splashy defender can get a mention or two, but the game is played at the line of scrimmage. Philly had the league's best defensive line, and if they're not the best offensive line, they're probably a close second. Even though they officially finished second here, they are clearly worthy Super Bowl champions. Taking the number 1 overall spot in this countdown are the Detroit Lions. They led the way in so many ways. They went 15-2. Their point differential was gaudy at plus 222. They led the league in scoring. They were actually 7th best in points allowed, and they were tied for the 9th hardest strength of schedule. They joined Green Bay as the only other team that's top 10 in all those categories. Now you might say they didn't win the Super Bowl, so they can't be the best team, but the best team doesn't win every game. If that were the case, every season would have an undefeated Super Bowl champion. What happens on the field on one Sunday doesn't always dictate an entire season. Their C-score was tops at 32.094. Had the Lions won the Super Bowl without even adding a single thousandth of a point to their C-score, they would have ranked as the 26th greatest Super Bowl champion of all time. Had they engineered a postseason that looked like the Eagles, they would have moved all the way up to the 7th greatest Super Bowl champion of all time. So much was left on the table for the Lions, and while they disappointed in the playoffs, which rightfully ended their run, their regular season was still a sight to behold. We promised to look at some other tidbits. We're going to do that right now. The teams in the AFC combined for a negative C-score of 34.443, while the teams in the NFC were at 37.933. So the NFC certainly looked like the better conference this season. That's even further elucidated when looking at the playoff fields from these conferences. The AFC is not too bad at 92.118 for their 7th playoff entrance, but the NFC somewhat blew that out of the water by almost 30 full points at 121.956. Breaking this down even further by division, we see that 2 of those divisions in the AFC dragged it down with negative C-scores, especially the South, ranking out, unsurprisingly, as the worst division in football this season. The best division was the West, with a total C-score of just over 22 points. It's the NFC whose divisions show us some great quality. The South is still also pretty bad, but also 20 full points better than their AFC counterpart. The East and the West pulled out positive numbers, but look at that North. 58.562 for the 4 teams in that division. That averages out to over 14.5 points per team. And now, here is a snapshot of all 32 teams together. It might be painful for Lions fans to see themselves in the number 1 spot. Being the best team in the league from a whole season perspective doesn't mean anything when you lose in the playoffs. The Eagles earned the number 2 spot, but they definitely earned a Lombardi that will be heading into their trophy case. This season has added further meaning to that old worn-out phrase, any given Sunday. You don't have to be the best team or even the better team in order to move on in the playoffs. You just have to outscore your opponents over the course of 60 minutes of game time. We repeat, if the best team always won, then every NFL season would have an undefeated Super Bowl champion. And watching the games just wouldn't be as fun. This is C-Score's full season evaluation for 2024. Thank you so much for watching to this point in the video. I kindly ask that you like and share it, subscribe to the channel if you've yet to do so, and ding that bell to be notified of all our future releases. Let me know what you think about all of this. Does winning the Super Bowl automatically make a team the best in the league across the entire season? Is one team with a better record automatically better than a team with a slightly worse record? Or is there a distinction between better and more successful that can be found with deeper analysis, such as that provided by C-Score? I would love to hear your thoughts on this or anything else you may have on your mind down in the comments section below. As mentioned in this video's introduction, this audience has proven its worth time and time again, and never more so than in the comments, which have always remained thoughtful and respectful even when there is disagreement. Healthy and honest debate is kind of the bedrock of civilization, and for you guys to always honor that tradition in our little ecosystem brings joy to my soul. Alright, enough with the sappiness. Thank you once again for joining us today, and until next time, I hope you have an awesome day.